Yeah, my question is in Second Chronicles 5:8. It says they're talking about bringing the Ark of the Covenant into the Holy of Holies, and the way it describes the cherubim wings covering the Ark, it almost sounds like they are actively moving their wings. The two huge gold statues are actively moving. And I went through the concordance, and it looks like the words used are the word that's normally used for actively covering and doing things, not just standing there putting it under a covering, but like something's been moved over it.
All right. Well, that's a really interesting insight that you were drawing from there. Let me just say that, first of all, the Ark of the Covenant was to be a representation of the throne of God on the earth. And when Moses was instructed to build the tabernacle, of all the pieces of furniture that he was to build, the Ark of the Covenant was the most significant, and it was placed in the holiest of all places. And God gave Moses specific instructions as to how this particular piece of furniture was to be built. Inside of the ark, we know there was the 10 Commandments, there was some manna, there was also the rod of Aaron that budded, and on top of the ark, well, it was the mercy seat. Now, the significance of the cherubim around the Ark of the Covenant, Pastor Scott, what would you say to that?
Well, what you see is when you look at both the tabernacle and the temple that was built, they follow the same general pattern. And so what's interesting is the Ark of the Covenant itself is literally a physical picture of the throne of God in heaven. It's a physical representation of the throne of God in heaven. The Holy of Holies is a physical representation of the throne room of God in heaven, of which we actually see in the book of Revelation in chapters 4 and 5. Now, what's interesting is, the writer of Hebrews talks about this, and what he tells us is that the tabernacle and the temple later, but the tabernacle was actually created and made. Moses received from God instructions to make all these things according to the pattern which God had showed him. So God actually gave him blueprints, actually gave him a pattern. I believe that pattern was the very presence of God. And when Moses then was instructed to put that, to metal and wood, and skins, it came up being the tabernacle that we had, which the temple was made after that same general pattern. So the Lord gave him all of the instructions of how to make it, but it tells us that the pattern was the throne room in heaven. It was where God dwelt. And we know that when we look at the book of Revelation, chapter 4 and 5, we look at, Ezekiel says a lot about this as well in the early chapters of Ezekiel, about how around the presence of God, which the mercy seat was a representation of the throne of God, around God's throne are angels, and there are cherubim, and there's the four living creatures, which seem to be some class of cherubim, and there's angels all around. And so that's why you have on the veil before you came into the Holy of Holies, you had the artwork, embroidery of cherubim on there, and then you had the cherub over the mercy seat. Now, what is very interesting is when you go back and you look at Ezekiel 28, Isaiah 14, it actually tells us that Satan himself, Lucifer, he was known by then, was the cherub that actually covered. And what that most likely refers to is at one place, the devil himself, Lucifer, as he was known then, which means son of the morning, he actually had this position where he was like one of those cherub that covered that you see in the tabernacle and the temple, that he was an angel, was a cherubim that was above the throne of God. And some say that because of his makeup that we read about, in Ezekiel and Isaiah, that he was the worship leader of all the other, he was leading all the other angels in worship in heaven. So that's kind of the background of all that, and why you kind of see that the way it is with the two cherubim over the mercy seat. But I do not know, and I've studied Hebrew for 5 years, and I don't know of anything in that verse that says that these cherubim, who are made of gold are moving at all, that there's any movement. If there's any movement that we see in these verses, it would be in the verse previous, where it actually tells us that the priests brought in the Ark of the Covenant. So they were moving the Ark of the Covenant into the Holy of Holies, which the cherubim would have been on the Ark of the Covenant. That's the only movement you see would be in verse 7, but them actually having their wings spread over the mercy seat. It's not that they spread them over, but those cherubim were created and were fashioned and made as if their wings are over the mercy seat. So that's what we see there, John.